everyone. Today I'm going to read and summarize this passage for you, which is a legacy of the Scythians. It is written by Peter Mumford and edited by Sam Bresser. So without further ado, let's start reading this. March 2022. Invading Russian forces have captured the city of Melitopol in south of Ukraine, one of the few successes amid the failure of the wider invasion of Ukraine. In the city's Museum of Local History, a collection of at least 198 golden artifacts is deliberately and systematically pilfered or those are being stolen by the occupiers. This is not the opportunistic haphazard looting of individual soldiers. According to the eyewitnesses and local officials, it is a well-organized, meticulous operation led by Russians claiming to be archaeological experts and enacted in the immediate aftermath of the city's capture. So the Russian forces seized Melitopol, looting the museum artifacts and all of those things, as being said by the eyewitnesses. The museum staff anticipated the danger, attempted to hide the artifacts in a cellar, but their efforts ultimately proved futile. Betrayed by a collaborator, they are forced to watch the Russians abscond or steal with the museum's prized possessions. So the museum staff tried to protect the artifacts, but their means effort was in fail. Around 2,700 kilometers away from Allard Prison Museum in Amsterdam, a similar collection of golden artifacts became embroiled in a legal battle lasting nearly a decade. Loaned to Amsterdam museums from the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, the artifacts were left in limbo after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. After a after three high-profile court cases to determine whether the artifacts should be returned to Crimea or Kiev, the Supreme Court of Netherlands finally ruled in Ukraine's favor in 2023. These artifacts and the collection stolen from Melitopol share common origin: the Scythian civilization that inhabited the steppes of present-day Ukraine and parts of Russia thousands of years ago. Far from being consigned to pages of ancient history, the Scythians have now found themselves on the cultural front lines of Russia's war against Ukraine. So the legal battle over Scythian artifacts was won by Ukraine, and this is how the Scythian history shapes Russia and Ukraine's identity. Though that's what the author is saying. The Scythians are known today from the substantial surviving archaeological evidence. Much of it is exquisite golden artifacts from warriors' tombs and from historical accounts from the ancient world. And the warrior people of Iranian ethnic origin, famous for their skills in mounted archery and their nomadic lifestyle, their presence in Ukraine and Russia has left a historical and archaeological legacy to both countries. Some evidence of a more symbolic cultural presence can be found in Russia, where elements of nationalist thoughts and political philosophy have conceptualized the Scythians as embodying both of like warlike side of Russian identity and its sense of cultural superiority over its neighbors. Although ancient history features infrequently in political discourse in both Ukraine and Russia, its relevance lies more in the illustration of all-encompassing nature of the existential war that Russia has brought to Ukraine. The significance of the Scythians, both in tangible and symbolic sense, to Russia and Ukraine cannot be considered independently of the wider context of the impact of Russia invasion on the cultural heritage of both countries. So the Scythian history shapes the Russian and Ukraine, their identity and also their war. So it was a symbolic representation of a war and Russia's personality towards other countries and its neighbors. So let's go to the next paragraph. Much of our knowledge of the Scythians and their culture comes from the writing of the 5th century BCE Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Okay, so Herodotus was the author from a place considered by many to be the father of history. He was also the first known historian of Ukraine. In his histories, a project that aimed to chronicle the extent of the known world and its people, he wrote extensively on Scythian culture, customs, and history. So Herodotus wrote about Scythian culture and the history and all of those things. The Scythians themselves left no written record and were likely illiterate, so we have to rely on ancient Greek writers like Herodotus to provide an insight to their world. So The author says that Scythians were not literate and they couldn't depict their own ideas on rocks or something else. So we had to rely on the author had to rely on the Herodotus' writings. The term Scythian has at times been used as a more general description of the nomadic steppe people of Central Asia, Caucasus, and Russia and Ukraine. Herodotus, however, defines Scythians as the inhabitants of the steppes of what is now Ukraine and also a small part of modern-day Russia between the 7th and the 3rd centuries BCE, having migrated there previously from Central Asia and land settled in the land the Greeks called Scythia. Okay, so they were from Russia and Ukraine, mostly from Ukraine, but the Greeks called them Scythian, means they were from Scythia, that's why they called them Scythians. It is unclear whether or not Herodotus ever visited Scythia, although there are several indications in his detailed account of the coastline of southern Ukraine that suggest that he traveled at least as far as Greek settlements on the shores of the Black Sea. Greek settlers developed commercial links with the Scythians down the Dnipro river. Okay, so that was a okay. So right now it's the Nile in Egypt. Some Scythians eventually intermarried with Greek settlers and lived alongside them in multicultural, multilingual trading communities along the river and the southern coast. Okay, this intercultural contact also allowed Scythians' legends and tales to make their way to the writings of Greeks and Herodotus. Okay, so Scythian legacy is deep and its outreach is massive. That's why they had relations with Greek and all those. So yeah, that's about it. One such legend made it significantly further than that. Mixed Parthenos, mixed Parthenos, yeah, a part woman or part snake goddess who was worshipped by the Scythians on the Crimean Peninsula and allegedly considered to be the mythological ancestor of Scythian race. Is figure that appears in the Starbucks logo. Okay, so the Scythians worshipped Mixoparthenos, who was a part woman and part snake, and it appears on the logo of Starbucks. Thousands of years later and thousands of miles across the world, the Scythians' legacy runs surprisingly deep. Herodotus' discussion of the Scythians focuses on a failed invasion of Scythia by the Persian Empire. The Persian king Darius, so this is a separate story, was allegedly motivated by a desire to avenge historical grievances around century earlier. Scythians had invaded the and occupied territory in modern-day Iran. In 513 BC, Darius led a vast force up to the western Black Sea coast, up the western Black Sea coast to establish Persian dominance over Scythia and further expand his colossal empire. Outnumbered and outmatched militarily, the various Scythian tribes united to resist the invasion and resorted to unorthodox tactics. Using the nomadic mobile lifestyle to their advantage, they avoided open battles with the Persian army and forced the invaders to chase them deep into their territory towards the Don River. They employed scorched earth tactics that left Scythia devastated but denied Persians any tangible victories. Eventually worn down by the fatigue and partisan raids and frustrated by the elusive nature of their force, the Persians were compelled to abandon their attempt of conquest. Okay, so there was a Persian attack by Darius, and the Scythians were able to stop it successfully. The accuracy of Herodotus' account is, of course, subject to debate, and his is the only surviving description of these events. More significant is the narrative he presents of a smaller, militarily inferior force successfully frustrating an invasion against the odds. Here the parallels with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine seem apparent, although it would be overly simplistic to map one attempt to conquest onto the other, not least because the identities and motives of the invaders differ substantially. Okay, so Herodotus' writing depict modern invasions like Russia-Ukraine, and it also depicts that a smaller force can fight against a bigger force. Okay. The Persians themselves seem to have told the story rather differently. A royal Persian inscription displayed at Darius's tomb at the Naksh-e-Rostam lists the Scythians across the sea among the people conquered by the Persians, and the separate inscription at Mount Behistun mentions Darius's conquest of Scythia, indicating that to a domestic Persian audience at least, Darius presented his campaign as a victory. There is no evidence of Persian political or administrative rule over Scythia, other than string of forts built on the banks of Don River that, according to Herodotus, were in ruins several decades later. Okay, so the Persians preferred to believe that Darius actually conquered Scythia, but eventually that was a means that was a false claim because they had built some forts alongside the river, which were they were brought down by the time. One anecdote from Herodotus relates that the Scythian king Edenthresus had a frog. Okay, so the Scythian king had a frog, a mouse, and a bird, and 5 arrows delivered to Darius with no further explanation. The Persians initially interpreted this as a pledge of allegiance, akin like similar to the symbolic offerings of earth and water that the Persians demanded from the conquered nations. But one of the Darius's advisors eventually gleaned the true meaning. Unless you become birds, Persians, and fly up into the sky, or mice and hide into the earth, or frogs and leap into the lakes, you will be shot by these arrows and never return home. Apart from being an example of Herodotus' characteristic narrative wit, the irreverence and mockery displayed by the Scythians held a reminiscent of some of the defiant Ukrainian responses to Russia's invasion. So Herodotus, like his writings, symbolizes to like modern day warfare as well. Responses to Russia's invasion, from the tiny garrison of Snake Island famous resort to the Russian flagship Moskva, to the innumerable memes circulated by the Ukrainians on social media to express their defiance and determination to resist invasion at all costs. Okay, so the Scythian mockery and defiance similar to Ukraine. That's what the author is suggesting. Apart from that, let's continue reading. After the failure of Darius's invasion, the Scythians continued to develop their commercial and cultural relations with Greek settlers in the region and remained in control of Scythia for several centuries until they were eventually displaced by the Sarmatians, another nomadic steppe from the people of steppe people from the east. By roughly 200 BCE, Scythian territory had dwindled to the Crimean Peninsula, and 4 centuries later, little trace of them remained. Okay, so the Scythians displaced by the Sarmatians, and they were finally vanished. Herodotus' account of Scythian resistance to the Persians is most relevant in its contribution to a cultural perception of the Scythians' indomitability, courage, and hardiness. This is not to say that his characterization of the Scythians was overwhelmingly positive. He recounts many of the more brutal alleged customs, such as drinking blood, scalping enemies, and performing human sacrifice, to name a few. This characterization led other Greek authors to depict the Scythians as stereotypical barbarians, uncouth, uncultured, and uncivilized. The Greek term originated as the general description for many people who did not speak Greek, conveying the meaning of foreigner or non-Greek, as well as barbarian in modern sense of the term. However, it gradually came to be associated with the hostile caricatures with which Greek literature portrayed foreigners. Okay, so the Scythians were resilient, but also they were unforgiving and brutal, and they were called barbarians by the Greek. Okay, so according to text, they were barbarians. Evidence from the Greek literature and vase paintings indicates that the presence of a group of Scythians as some sort of police force in Athens during Herodotus' lifetime. The circumstances surrounding the establishment and responsibilities of this force remain unclear, but it's likely that encountering Scythians in their daily lives would have helped Greeks to associate them with the image of barbarian. A member of this alleged police force appears as a Scythian archer in a play by the comic playwright Aristophanes, speaking broken Greek and intended as an object of mockery, a far cry from the Scythians of Herodotus' history. Okay. So the Greek had their societal perceptions and prejudices toward the Scythians. So that's about the depiction of the Scythians by the ancient writers, from their customs and practices to historical events such as Darius' invasion of Scythia, may not be entirely accurate, but this matters less than the lasting cultural perception of the Scythians as a warlike savage, but also indomitable and powerful people, rulers of steppes and in the far north of the known world. This undoubtedly influenced later cultural conceptualizations of the Scythians and in the lands they once inhabited, particularly in Russia, where nationalist thought has incorporated the image of Scythian into a wider conception of Russian identity. Okay. So the cultural perception of the Scythians were means the Russians were influenced by the cultural perception of the Scythian, the brutality, their unforgiving nature, and those kind of things. The symbolic appeal of the Scythians to a nationalist ideology Russia in Russia began in the 19th century and still exists to a certain extent. The discovery and excavations of Scythian burial mounds from the 18th century onwards acquired more widespread public interest in the Scythians. So the burial mounds gathered more interest from people about the Scythians. Dotting the steppes of Ukraine and Russia, many kurhani or the burial grounds were found to contain valuable Scythian artifacts worked in gold and silver. Ukraine's most prized Scythian artifact is an elaborate golden pectoral from the uh, Tovsta Kurhan, means which is a burial ground. So Ukraine has its most prized Scythian artifact from a burial ground discovered in 1971 near the city of Pokrov. Made from solid gold, it depicts intricately worked scenes of humans and animals. So you can see this artifact. So yeah, other finds in Kurhani provided evidence of Scythians' extensive trade links with regions as far away as China, from where the artifacts were originated. Excavations of Greek settlements in the 19th century also unearthed Scythian relics such as limestone statue of Mixoparthenos and some other things as well. Although many of Kurhani were physically located in Ukraine, no distinction or ownership was made between finds from excavations in Ukraine and those in Russia elsewhere until Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. So there were no discussed ownership of those burial grounds were established until 1991. Inspired by the archaeological discoveries, a literary and cultural movement known as Schizo, some name, emerged in the 19th century Russia that identified ideologically with the Scythians and Russia's cultural forebearers. These poets and artists viewed the Scythians through the lens of Russia, embracing its identity both as Asiatic and European, as well as freeing itself from the constraints of moderation and etiquette. They were idealized in art and poetry as wild, untamed, and fierce warriors, living in harmony with the natural world. In the words of historian Orlando Figes, the Scythians became a symbol of wild, rebellious nature of primeval Russian man. One Pushkin's poem contained the lines, "Now temperance is not appropriate. I want to drink like a savage Scythian." Association of the Scythians with the drunkenness has been a literary trope since ancient Greek times. Okay, so the Russian imagined Scythians as wild, untamed warriors, and they probably liked it. So yeah, let's continue reading. Perhaps the most famous example of the poem "Skiffy" by Alexander Blok, in which poet emphatically identifies Russia with the Scythians as a means of asserting a cultural superiority over West and East alike. The poem depicts Russians as Scythians, keeping two hostile powers, Old Europe and barbarous Mongol horde, at bay, using the image of the Scythian to present Russia as superior to both in terms of the population size, military strength and national character. So, yeah, so the Skiffy poem related Russians to Scythians and yeah, means marking their superiority. The Scythians have since been appropriated as a symbol of cultural superiority by present-day Russian nationalists, but any remaining links with the Scytho of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are tangential and distorted. One fringe group calls itself the New Scythians and members of a notorious far-right biker gang involved in the invasion of Crimea have been used the pseudonym Scythian when interviewed by international media. These groups subscribe to the wider ideology of Uranianism, a far-right ultranationalist movement that seeks to restore Russian dominance over its neighbor in Eurasia, especially Ukraine. Eurasianism is at its core deeply hostile to the West and supportive of a Russia-dominated sphere of influence that corresponds to the former borders of the Soviet Union. Its proponents, most notably the far-right philosopher Alexander Dugin, have spent the decades advocating against Ukrainian independence and in favor of Russian political control over its neighbor. The image of Scythian is admittedly a minor element of this strain of nationalist ideology. So the present-day Russian nationalists support the Scythians and their domination. So yeah, that's what the paragraph talked about. Scythians have, however, made a recent cinematic experience in a big-budget Russian historical fantasy epic released in 2018. Skiff imagines means the movie imagines the a historical existence of group of Scythians in the medieval state of Kievan Rus, the last remnants of the ancient civilization who have somehow survived centuries after the historical presence of this lands in these lands. Despite this historical inaccuracy and the film's brutal, almost comically overblown action scenes, the film's depiction of the Scythians themselves is fascinating. Rustam Mosafir, the film's director, was evidently familiar with the Herodotus tales of the Scythians, presenting them as savage, nomadic riders who set the plot in motion by abducting the wife and child of the protagonist, Leutobor, a Kievan Rus warrior. So yeah, that was the plot of the story. To save them, Leutobor is forced to make an uneasy alliance with the Scythian outcast. Over the course of the film, this develops into a sense of mutual respect, despite the cultural gulf between them. So the Skiff movie blends the Scythian character with the fantasy. So yeah, that's about it. Skiff contrasts the brutal but honor-bound Scythians with duplicity, conspiracy, and power struggles of the film's Kievan Rus. This is exemplified by the character of Oleg, based on a real-life Rus prince. At the film's conclusion, Oleg massacres the entire Scythian tribe after promising them his protection, asserting that he will have absolute dominance over his land and that no people other than his will inhabit it. Lyutobor subsequently refuses to recognize Oleg's authority and declares himself to be Scythian instead, thereby rejecting his Theban Rus identity and self-identifying the last of the Scythians. So this chief glorified the Scythians and compared to deceitful Kievan Russians. Like they compared the Russians to be deceitful, means they made Russians to be deceitful, and then they glorified the Scythians. Given the prominence of Kievan Rus in Russian nationalist thought and pseudo-historical narratives that identify Kievan Rus with the modern Russian imperialist project, it is striking that Skiff invites its Russian audience to identify instead with the seemingly culturally alien, barbaric Scythians. The cynical perspective on the power and authority articulated by Oleg is particularly interesting and considering the fact that Skiff was filmed in Crimea and in the years following to Russia's annexation of the peninsula. Whether or not Musafir intended Skiff to be subversive, it would be difficult to interpret its depiction of the Scythians as inspired by the Russian nationalism. So, the movie's portrayal of Scythians challenged Russian nationalist their narratives. So, yeah. Russia's current invasion of Ukraine has brought the Scythians to the world's notice, most notably with the lengthy legal dispute over the Scythian artifacts in the Netherlands. Over 10 years ago, shortly before Russia's invasion of Crimea, an exhibition of Scythian artifacts was displayed at the Allard Pierson Museum in Amsterdam. Entitled "Crimea: Golden Island in the Black Sea", It displayed 565 artifacts from Crimean museums, including golden ceremonial helmets and weapons and ornate jewelry, intricately worked by the skilled Scythian craftsmen. Most were made from gold, but not all. Their estimated combined value was almost 1.5 million euros. By the time the exhibition concluded, Crimea had been occupied by Russia and a dispute arose about whether the Crimean artifacts should be returned to the original museums or to Kiev. Naturally, the Crimean Museum requested the return of the artifacts. Ukraine claimed the collection was its legal property and that returning the artifacts to occupied territory would effect be relinquishing them to Russia. Okay, so the dispute over Scythian artifacts highlights the complex legal battle between Russia and Ukraine. The dispute resulted in a 9-year legal marathon in the Dutch courts, eventually reaching to the Supreme Court. All three of the court rulings, by a lower court in 2016, a court of appeal in 2021, and the Supreme Court in 2023, were in Ukraine's favor. The Crimean Museums appealed the result of each case, but their efforts were in vain. In June 2023, the Supreme Court rejected their final appeal, upholding the decision of the lower courts. In November, the artifacts were finally returned to Kiev, where they currently reside. Russian media and politicians denounced the Dutch courts as biased and politicized and claimed that they were true victims of the theft and issued a slew of vague threats. Okay. So the legal battle ended in Ukraine's favor, and people in Russia accused the Dutch courts, telling that they were biased. Litigation has been far from the only consequence of Russian claims to Scythian artifacts from Ukraine, as demonstrated by theft of Melitopol's Scythian collection. The Museum of Locals Lore in the southern city of Kherson faced a similar fate. When Ukrainian troops retook the city in November 2022, they found the museum stripped bare of they found the museum stripped bare of Scythian and other artifacts by the Russians. Unlike Kherson, Melitopol remains under Russian occupation, but its golden Scythian artifacts are presumably now ensconced within museums of Russia itself. These acts indicate a motive deeper than simply greed. Russia is attempting to deny Ukraine its cultural heritage and claim for its own. Okay, so Russia's seizure of these artifacts reflects a broader attempt to erase Ukrainian heritage. So yeah, that's about it. Yet despite this, the Scythians are still rarely if ever mentioned in contemporary Russian discourse. This is particularly unusual given the current tendency of the Russian politicians and media to weaponize history in order to assert Russian greatness and justify its imperialist ambitions in Ukraine and elsewhere. In a recent interview with the American right-wing media personality Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin declaimed a lengthy list of historical grievances, many dating to medieval times, in order to justify his invasion of Ukraine. The Scythians received no mention; indeed, it's striking, given the frequency of the use of historical narratives in the today's Russian political and media environment, that they feature only in fringe far-right political theory. Even the discussion of the dispute over the Scythian artifacts of Crimea reveals more about the Russian efforts to assert control over Crimea and its cultural heritage than it does about attitudes to the Scythians themselves. Okay, so the unusual suppression of Scythians of Russia is to justify their invasion. So it's rather a political motive than a historical thing. That's what the author is suggesting. Russia's designs on Ukraine's Scythian artifacts are merely a single aspect of its broader attempt to appropriate, subsume, and erase Ukrainian cultural identity. It has become a central objective of Russia's war. Putin's denial of Ukraine's right to exist and independence of Ukrainian culture from Russia predates the full-scale invasion of 2022. Similarly, similar views have been shared by a wide range of prominent Russian politicians, journalists, and public figures, many of whom have also called the destruction of Ukraine and its people and publicly shared genocidal opinions. Okay, so this is a continuation of the last paragraph about erasing Ukraine's heritage. Russia's full-scale invasion attempted to transform this rhetoric into reality. The invading forces have deliberately targeted and destroyed hundreds of Ukrainian sites of cultural heritage. Looting has been widespread, forcing museum curators across the country to take specific measures to safeguard their collections, including Scythian artifacts. In the regions it has occupied, Russia has erected posters and billboards portraying Russian cultural and literary figures, some deliberately positioned atop the ruins of Ukrainian cultural heritage. Um, Sites destroyed by its bombing. Okay, so heritage sites destroyed by its bombing. In Mariupol, occupying Russian forces constructed a crude facade depicting Russian literary and cultural figures around the ruins of city's famous theater, destroyed by Russian shelling that killed up to 600 Ukrainians. The looting of artifacts from cities such as Kherson and Melitopol signifies not that the Scythians are intrinsically culturally important to Russia, but that they represent the tangible cultural history of a country that Russia claims as its own. In an existential effort to assert Russian dominance over Ukrainian culture and in its entirety, ancient history has not been spared. So Russians looting and the spreading of propaganda was aimed at asserting dominance rather than claiming the history. This attempt, like Russia's invasion, will not succeed. So this is the final thought of the author. The Scythians are part of the history of both nations. Despite its efforts, Russia has not been and will not be able to deny Ukraine and its historical and cultural identity. As for the artifacts themselves, the Scythian gold collection at the center of the Dutch legal dispute is now back in Kiev, but it is not its final destination. Volodymyr Zelensky has stated when the Ukrainian flag flies in Crimea once more, the Scythian artifacts will return along with it. The eventual return of those stolen from Melitopol seems far less likely at present, but however long it takes, these artifacts have already survived for thousands of years. They will endure. So the author's final thoughts are: despite the challenge of invasion, these artifacts and the symbol of Ukraine's heritage will endure and survive. So that was the passage about Scythians and Ukraine's cultural heritage, which has been denied by the Russians as of now. But the author thinks that it won't be further. So yeah, that's about it. See you in the next video.